Good afternoon, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the Z-List Cars. My name is Matt, and in my inaugural episode, I discussed with you guys my top 5 least favorite automotive redesigns of all time. I hope you enjoyed it. I had mentioned at the time that my list of smile-inducing redesigns would be a very long one. However, I thought it would be fun to narrow it down, so I decided to make it happen. And in this episode, we're going to discuss my top 5 favorite automotive redesigns of all time. So let's get started. My 5th favorite automotive redesign of all time will focus on what was at one time Cadillac's import fighter, the Seville. And particularly the transition from the 3rd generation, which lasted from 1986 to 1991, into the 4th generation, which lasted from 1992 to 1997. One thing to know about me, as evidenced by one of the props on the wall behind me, is that I'm a huge fan of the North Star era Cadillacs. In fact, the North Star V8 engine cover behind me comes from my personal 2002 Cadillac Seville STS that I owned in the past. I loved it, I enjoyed it, despite being a money pit. We might talk about that in another episode. The Seville had been around since the 70s and was kind of Cadillac's attempt at an import fighter due to the ever-increasing popularity at the time of brands like Mercedes-Benz and Jaguar. Ultimately, Cadillac was losing that battle. As many of us car people will know, the 70s and 80s were affectionately known as, I've always loved this term, the malaise era. And that was mainly due to stricter emission standards and thus significantly less horsepower and torque and engine performance than the muscle era of the 1960s. American cars were just about at their worst during this era, and Cadillac and GM as a whole was no exception to this. The 3rd generation Seville, like the one that came before it, was unfortunately a pretty relevant example of this low quality. I thought it looked rather cheap, small, and unremarkable even for a Cadillac of that era, which at the time touted themselves to be the standard of the world. Fast forward to 1992, when the 4th generation Seville was unveiled. What a transformation. Big body sleekness was back, and the lines looked rather European and muscular and elegant, and the interior and overall technology were also leaps and bounds ahead of the Seville that it replaced. The introduction of the North Star system, including the 4-cam, 4.6-liter all-aluminum V8 that I love, put down about 100 horsepower more than the previous engine that was in the Seville. The performance of the newer Cadillacs with the North Star system would be far away and better from the previous Cadillacs of the 80s, and was actually on par, if not ahead of, much of the European competition as well. Other styling elements, such as a long LED brake light strip over the trunk lid, which is actually still a trend that's in automotive design today, the 4 large oval exhaust outlets, brought the Seville and the sporty STS model really well into the current decade. For performance credentials, the main issue with these cars was that they were front-wheel drive, which usually results in a lot of torque steer. Now, the STS trim of the Seville was putting out nearly 300 horsepower, even in 1993, and it did so ultimately without a lot of torque steer, which is pretty impressive. I just love these cars, the sound they made of the engine, the lazy boy-esque plush leather seats, and the ultra-smooth ride. So much so that I own 2 North Star Cadillacs, including one Seville, a 5th generation 2002 STS model. Okay, so number 4 on my top 5 favorite automotive redesigns of all time. This takes us into the early days of Honda's upscale brand, Acura, and back to the time before Acura went to the completely alphanumeric naming system, back when they had really cool names like Legend. Acura Legend was essentially the upscale brand's flagship sedan, and that 1st generation in the 80s was a handsome vehicle. It didn't really offer much of a competitive edge in terms of performance or luxury, but quality was high, reliability was above average, and it was enough to keep the brand moving into what I feel, and many others might feel, was kind of a golden era for Acura. It was the early 90s. So with the 2nd generation of Legend, which came out in 1991, the styling inside and out was caught up with modern times, and it had an understated and elegant but very distinct look of its own, I thought. Things heated up a lot more with the introduction of the coupe, the 2-door, and the Type 2 V6 with 230 horsepower. There was even a 6-speed manual offered. 2-door front-wheel drive NSX, anyone? Okay, I'll settle down. Number 3. So 3rd on my favorite automotive redesigns of all time. This is going to focus on the world of the 1990s Japanese bubble era supercars, and particularly the Toyota Supra. Now for me, it's the current bring-a-trailer holy grail, A80 or the Mark IV Supra. So for the first couple generations, the Supra was essentially a top-trim Toyota Celica. The two models were grouped together, and in the mid-1980s, the Supra broke off as its own model, more of a grand touring / sports car with more power and more standard equipment. My take on the third generation Supra is that it was a really cool-looking car for the 80s. Kind of a how can you not like them, pop-up headlights were included, had a long hood, had powerful for the time turbocharged V6 engines, and a really sporty cockpit. And this truly was a special car in the 80s, and my opinion is that it was more desirable than just about anything domestic at the time. However, fast forward to 1993, and with the introduction of the A80 or the Mark IV Toyota Supra, things were really turned up to 11. Styling went from angular 1980s to bulbous 1990s, but in a very good way, I thought. Bodywork was flowing and sculpted, and the headlights and taillights looked very next generation, and even the taillights I think still look very unique today. The interior also had a very driver-focused center stack and more comfortable seats and more luxury amenities than it ever had before. And although the weight was increased, power was very much increased as well compared to the outgoing model, with turbo models making upwards of 300 horsepower towards the end, over 320. It was pretty scorching at the time. However, since we're focusing on design here, I have always felt that this was a major step forward from the previous body style, and if you would all follow the market for these cars and bring a trailer auctions and stuff, you can see that they're really bringing all the money today. I mean, at the time, if you bought in the mid-1990s a Supra Turbo, they were going to set you back a little over $40,000. Nowadays, a low mileage showroom example of a turbo manual brings well over $100,000. Let that sink in a little bit. So number 2 on the list of my favorite automotive redesigns of all time. All right, time to talk about a sports car as American as apple pie or as KFC's Double Down. That's right, the Chevrolet Corvette. No, we're not going to talk about the C8 or what kind of cars you can get for C8 money, but I love you guys, Car Trek, you know who you are. What I feel is the best transition was from the 4th generation C4 model to the 5th generation C5. C4 was well loved by many, and I do think it looked the part for the 1980s American sports / muscle car that it was, especially when it debuted in 1984 with a focus on handling. It had a digital dashboard, pop-up headlights, and very modernized body lines compared to the old C3 it replaced. However, as time went on, like most long model runs, it was looking pretty long in the tooth by the time the mid-1990s rolled around, especially next to its competition. There were some pretty awesome performance variants of the C4 generation, such as the mighty ZR1 and also the Grand Sport. It was really time for an upgrade. Enter the C5 in 1997 with its curvaceous and muscular body style, 4 oval taillights and exhaust finishers, and final generation of the pop-up headlights, and we all had the automotive redesign winner we were looking for in the Corvette. Now, this is debatable, of course, as are all of my opinions on here, but I think the C5 really looked awesome at the time it came out, and although it had a cheap plasticky interior, it always has and still does offer an exceptional performance car value. All right, on to my number 1 favorite automotive redesign of all time. That's right, this is a big one, guys. I guess that's why it's number 1. I'm going to talk here about the Nissan 300ZX. Had to go with this, and this particularly the changeover from the Z31 model, first generation 300ZX, to the Z32. The Z31 was the first Z car that carried the moniker 300ZX. And although not as good looking as the original Datsun 240 in my opinion, I still thought it was a decent overall option as a sports car in the 80s. It was produced from 1984 to 1989 in the US, and it was a front-engine, rear-wheel drive sports coupe with V6 engines, choice of a manual or automatic transmission, pop-up headlights again, and it did offer a turbo variant that made over 200 horsepower. I always thought it was a pretty good choice for the 80s, competitive, just not outstanding. But man, oh man, did that redesigned model that came out for the 1990 model year in the US look like it fast-forwarded decades ahead, at least to me. I'm talking, of course, about the Z32 with its exotic-looking wedge-shaped body, integrated headlights, low wide stance, horizontal taillights, and 4 exhaust finishers. To me, this just represents the single greatest automotive leap forward of all time in one model year. Just park a clean 1989 US Z31 300ZX next to a clean 1990 Z32 and tell me I'm wrong. A fun fact about these cars is that they actually share the same exact headlights with the later Lamborghini Diablo. and even down to the part number. This was a Nissan design that Lamborghini bought for their own iconic model. Pretty cool. In addition to what I feel like was a radical styling upgrade, this, like the aforementioned Supra, also gained a tremendous amount of power, performance, and technology compared to its predecessor. The turbo trim had 300 horsepower, high-cost four-wheel steering, which stood for high-capacity active steering, twin turbochargers, and much more. Although I'm generally not a fan of white cars, man, give me a pearl white, 1991, let's say, two-seater, turbo with tan leather. Now we're talking. Well, that'll be all for today's episode of the Z-List Cars, guys, and my top 5 best automotive redesigns of all time. Thanks again for tuning in, and if you like what you see, please do consider subscribing. And until next time, stay safe, happy motoring, and I'll see you soon.